Okay, so as I said, we were looking for ways to save money, and one of the biggest expenses we have is our military. So in 1921, Senator William E. Barra from Idaho suggested that there be an international conference to set the size of navies. The government strongly supported this, and in November of 1921, Harding invited the major powers to Washington, D.C. Now, U.S. and Britain have the world's largest navies, and we don't want to have to keep expanding it to maintain our dominance, because it costs a lot of money to keep up a navy. But pressures on China could threaten the open door policy. So they had the Washington Naval Conference, where Hughes called for participants to scrap almost 2 million tons of warships, mainly battleships, to put a 10-year ban on naval construction. And also to limit the size of navies. Basically, the ratio would be for every 5 ships that Britain had, the U.S. could have 5 ships, Japan could have 3, and Italy and France could have 1.67. I know, weird number. Now, most of the public and even other nations agreed, well, all except for Japan. But we press on as we had already broken the Japanese diplomatic code. And finally they agreed to do it. Now when the conference ended in 1922, 9 treaties were signed amongst the nations of no capital ships for 10 years, prohibit the use of poison gas, and not to attack each other's Asiatic possessions. It was called the Nine Power Pact, that confirmed support for the sovereign and territorial boundaries of China and guaranteed commercial access to China. Problem with this, though, was we didn't really discuss smaller ships. So in 1930, they had the London Naval Conference that established ratios for smaller ships. And by the mid-1930s, Japan wants naval equality, so they began building new warships. The U.S. and England followed. But guys, for a little while it seemed like everything was working. I mean, in 1923, Senator Barra introduced a resolution to outlaw war, which failed. But the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 was signed by 15 nations, including Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and the U.S., where each country basically renounced the use of war as an instrument of national policy and agreed to settle disputes peacefully. And eventually, 64 nations signed that thing. So by the end of 1928, America's independent internationalism appeared to be a success. America's business investments and loans were fueling an expansive world economy. But of course, we're trying to protect our Asian investments through agreements with Japan. And with control of Latin America and the Caribbean, everything appeared promising. Well, it all appeared promising until it didn't. Ready for the next slide? The failure of prosperity. Okay. The failure of prosperity. Getting ready to go. Okay, the 1928 election. Basically, Coolidge surprised everybody in August of 1927 when he told reporters that he wasn't going to run in 1928. And I mean, this seemed crazy because he seemed to be doing so well. His Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, was chosen to be the next candidate. This was at Stanford Football Stadium, where he stated to the crowd, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before. The poorhouse is vanishing amongst us." Well, who did the Democrats pick? They picked Al Smith, that real reform-minded New York governor I told you about. But his opponents didn't like his Catholic big city ways, his opposition to prohibition, his Tammany Hall connections. Tammany Hall was a huge political machine. I mean, even his New York accent put a lot of people off. Indeed, evangelist Billy Sunday was kind of like the Billy Graham, big, huge Christian revivalist. But Billy Sunday called his supporters damnable whiskey politicians, bootleggers, crooks, pimps, and the businessmen who deal with them. So the voters saw the hard work, Protestant, small town values versus urban upheaval, machine politics, foreigners, and Catholics. So Hoover won 58% of the popular vote. But the Dems made huge leaps in the North, however. From 1920 to 1924, 12 of the largest cities voted Republican. In 1928, only one of the largest cities voted Republican, Los Angeles. Now, Hoover was the first president who was born west of the Mississippi. He wanted to be a very active president, bringing a new day for America, both at home and abroad. He called his approach associationalism, where there'd be voluntary cooperation between competing groups. And it was the role of the government to help out this cooperation and utilize antitrust laws to do it. So basically, he thought the government was there to help businesses get along. The origins of the Depression. When Hoover entered office, everything seemed well, as he was ready to observe the final triumph over poverty. Our prosperity, however, depended on a few key industries, like construction, automobiles, consumer goods. Other sectors were barely making a profit, like textiles, steel, and iron. And farming and mining were facing losses. And in the South and Midwest, from 1921 to 1928, more than 5,000 rural banks closed. Basically, we were dealing with a false wealth and misdistribution of wealth and overproduction of goods. And everybody was buying on credit on money they didn't have. Getting ready to go to the next slide. I mean, you had corporate profits that had risen 62%. Dividends 65%, wages had increased 11%, while the prices of goods fell. And by 1929, 513 families had annual incomes of more than $1 million. And the top 5%, or the top fifth, controlled 60% of the nation's wealth. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, when you have that much capital locked up at the top, should something happen, you're not going to have the massive amounts of money with middle and lower classes that are going to be able to keep the economy going along. Next slide. So what were the economic realities? Well, basically you had 70% of American families earning below adequate incomes of just $2,000 a year. 80% had no savings. Many were living off of credit, and any change in employment, credit policy, or their paycheck meant hard times were ahead. Basically, many were living off of credit, and any changes to employment, credit policy, or paycheck meant hard times. You had the maldistribution of wealth that put too much money in too few hands to fuel economic growth. Factories that overproduced products and began to lay off workers by 1929. I mean, even the boom industries were showing signs of weakening. And due to our isolationist nature, where we didn't want to participate with other nations, we didn't have any foreign markets, and manufacturers were unwilling to lower their prices here. So to stimulate foreign trade, Hoover lowered tariffs by as much as 50%. This, of course, was in the hopes that the other nations would lower their tariffs, and we'd hopefully sell some more American goods to foreign countries. Okay, getting ready to go to the next slide. So what does everybody blame the Depression on? Well, a lot of people point to the stock market plunge, where you had credit-stimulated consumer buying, which was a boom to the stock market. Stock prices rose or fell with very little reflection on their actual worth. You had RCA going from $95 a share to $178 a share in just 1 year. GM went from $99 a share to $212 a share in 3 years. And on October 24th, 1929, you had Black Thursday, where all of a sudden no one wanted to buy the stocks and everybody wanted to sell. And as you can guess, as nobody was buying, stock prices began to fall. And by midday, when the stock prices reached, the news of the stocks price going down had reached the other shore of America, you had a flood of people wanting to sell. And during lunch break, some New York businessmen tried to rally the market by buying up the stock, which leveled out the market, and it worked, at least for a week. Then all of a sudden, You have on Monday, October 28th, stock prices dipped. And on Black Tuesday, October 29th, they plunged. Hold on. There we go. From September to mid-November, the New York Times Industrials fell from $469 to $221. Points. Reaching 58 by mid-1932. RCA fell from $101 a share down to only 28. Montgomery Ward's fell from 138 down to only 59. You had hundreds of brokers and speculators totally ruined. And while the stock market plunge wasn't responsible for the Great Depression, it was a catalyst that pushed a weak economy into a depression. The corporations were very weak, as many had borrowed to invest in the stock market. You had banks and brokers that began to demand repayment on the loans they had made, and people and businesses default on their loans, unable to meet the demands of the depositors. The banks fail. The middle and upper classes find themselves without savings, dependent on jobs and installment payments to cover their debts. Investors are now wary. Corporations cut production and lay off workers. Consumers are hesitant to spend money. All results in the worst and longest lasting depression of American history. All right, on to the next slide. Basically, internationally, Europe had been dependent on U.S. loans and markets. But when we passed the Hart-Smalley tariff in 1930 to protect against foreign competition, it was catastrophic for world trade. Basically, it cut off goods that could have given Europe the money to pay back their loans. And now Europe doesn't want American goods anyway. So in 1932, American exports fell to the lowest level since 1905, which kicks off a worldwide depression in 1932. Stock markets continue to plummet. U.S. Steel goes into a free fall from $202 a share down to only $22 a share. GM, which was at $73 a share, falls to only $8. And by 1929 and 1932, 90,000 businesses fail. Corporate profits are down 60%. 9,000 banks close, where the depositors lose $2.5 billion. And as you can guess, purchases fell, like autos are down 75%. Getting ready to go to the next slide. About the only thing that was doing good was unemployment. What? It rose from 3% in 1929 to 9% by 1930. And by 1933, it's up to 25% of the American population doesn't have jobs. Okay, on to the next slide. So what is the government going to do about it? Well, guys, the government used to not get that involved in the economy. Basically, it was through tariffs. And initially, a lot of people thought the drop in the stock market was a good thing, that it would somehow cleanse the economy of the inflated value of stocks, because there was a big held belief that the government should let the problem take care of itself. Hoover, however, thought that the government should play a limited role. Okay, so the next slide. So what were Hoover's early policies? He basically called the leaders of business, pleading them not to cut their wages or lay off their workers. He also talked to union leaders, asking them not to demand wage increases. So you had places like Ford that instead of laying off workers, it cut the hours of its workers. So you might be making half as much, but at least you got a job. Basically, he assured the public that all was sound and improvements would come soon. He referred to the public crisis as a depression, not the traditional panic, to assuage the fears of the people. Now, why might this work? Well, guys, which sounds worse? Panic? Ah! Or depression? They're just depressed. He lowered taxes and interest rates to stir investment. He convinced Congress and state governments to support public works projects like highways, government facilities, Boulder Dam. And the federal government did increase its public spending by as much as 2 times. So it doubles its public spending. Well, does this solve the problem? No, the economy continues to worsen. And people still blamed him. Mellon pulled the whistle, Hoover rang the bell, Wall Street gave the signal, and the country went to hell. I'm ready to change slides. Oops. By the end of 1932, workers' incomes had fallen 40%. Unemployment, like I told you, was up at 25%. You had small towns that were hit the hardest, like Donora, Pennsylvania, had 277 jobs for its population of 14,000. You had thousands of displaced men and women who began to roam the country in search of employment, developing a kind of coyote mentality to survive. They're called the hobos. Now, you did have private charities that tried to help with like soup lines. Only problem is, they're going to run out of soup. Okay, getting ready to switch slides. You had huge shanty towns that were built up. They were called Hoovervilles. Of course, in this, if you might go to sleep covering yourself with a Hoover blanket, also known as a newspaper. And if you were really tooling around in style, you might drive a Hoover car or something pulled by a horse. But what about the farmers? Okay, I'll tell you about the farmers. Guys, as you can guess, farmers have it much worse. Especially when the subsidy of buying the U.S. government buying wheat at 80 cents a bushel ran out of money when the farm board ran out of money. So you had a third of all the farm households in bankruptcy. And in some places like South Dakota, it might be as much as 60%. And when basically your land is foreclosed upon or taken by the government, you are thrown out. You have the Dust Bowl hit in the 1930s where winds might whip up clouds of dust to 200 plus miles long and 7,000 to 8,000 feet high. Indeed, by 1938, more than 850 million acres of topsoil had been lost due to erosion. Now the farmers, like we've always talked about, they took their frustration to action. You had Milo Reno forming the Farmers Holiday Association in 1932, where he called upon farmers to destroy their products and to resist foreclosures. When you take a man's horse and his plow away, you denied him food, you just convicted his family to starvation, was what he would say. He organized farmers, armed them, and basically utilizing threats of violence, ensured that foreclosed items at auction were sold to their former owners at a fraction of the cost. And even though outside agitators were blamed, the protests were all homegrown, and basically they wanted the government to somehow help out the farmer. All right, getting ready to go to the next slide. Hoover's final efforts. Well, in December of 1931, Hoover gave in to public pressure and began to create government agencies to study unemployment and reform the banking system. He started the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which provided emergency funding for banks, life insurance companies, the railroad, and farm mortgage associations. The Glass-Steagall Act was passed to put more money into the system, and the Federal Home Loan Bank Act allowed homeowners to have lower mortgages. Hoover basically tried to solve the Depression by pumping money into banks, savings and loans associations, railroads, insurance companies, and large corporations. Basically, this was a belief in trickle-down economics, where if you give money to the people at the top, they're going to invest it and spend it down, so it's going to help out the little guys. And also, you shore up the businesses that own the mortgages to like these homes and these farms. Now, after 5 months of operation, $805 million had been loaned out, mostly to large businesses, but little seemed to be getting down to the workers. Opponents start calling for direct relief payments. Basically, Hoover felt that private organizations and local governments should give the money. So he was kind of opposed to direct relief payments. He did, however, finally bring the Emergency Relief Division to provide $300 million to the states. Few states and cities, however, wanted to go further into debt by borrowing the money to deal with their poor. Also, it didn't do too much. For example, in West Virginia, they borrowed $9 million for its poor, which gave only about $10 per family, and higher taxes had to be passed to pay it all off. By the summer of 1932, the Farmers' Holiday movement is spreading, and the Bonus Army, which was 20,000 unemployed veterans, marched on Washington, D.C. to get an early payment of their veterans' bonuses for the war. Hoover let them into the city, gave them tents, food, clothing, medicine. But when the bill went before the Senate, they were ordered to disperse, and it was turned down. Now, about half of the vets did leave, about 10,000, but half stayed in tents or in condemned buildings. The police attempt to move in, and 5,000 vets versus 800 cops clash. 2 Bonus Army members were killed, and the Army under General Douglas MacArthur moved in, and utilizing sabers, rifles, tear gas, and bayonets, forced the vets from their homes. You had more than 100 vets injured, and rumors began to spread, and Hoover defends himself by saying, hey, these protesters were nothing but a bunch of communists. Diplomacy of the Depression. Well, Latin America began to demand the withdrawal of American troops in Haiti and Nicaragua. Hoover continued the withdrawal and pretty much told American businesses that they should not expect the government to come to their aid. This actually causes respect for America to go up in foreign markets. In Europe, many people blamed America. In Asia, Japan was dependent on foreign trade and food. The Japanese rejected the free trade, and the nationalist movement that's going on in Japan began to hungrily look towards the Chinese province of Manchuria, an area that was rich in coal as well as in rice and vital foodstuffs. So in September of 1931, the Japanese conflict with Chiang Kai-shek of China erupted into conflict with troops, and a small group of Japanese nationalists take over Manchuria, a whole province. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Didn't we have the League of Nations to prevent this? Well, guys, the world governments protest, but nobody does anything. And so by 1933, Japan reacts by simply withdrawing from the League of Nations. Okay, getting ready to go to the next slide. All right, Depression America. Guys, this was something that touched every life in America, forcing changes in lifestyle, in thought, in politics. I mean, poverty was no longer limited to the lazy or unworthy, or those that lived in remote areas or in the inner cities. Like I said, it's something that touched almost everybody. Well, what's everybody's first line of defense? Well, just like now, back then it was families in the Depression. Annual incomes had dropped about 35% from 1929 to 1933, from about $2,300 a year to $1,500. What was really popular in the newspapers were so-called depression recipes that they'd print that could feed a family of 5 on only $8 a week. Well, the problem was most families didn't even have $8 a week. Work relief only paid $4.20 a week. New York City, they could only provide $2.30 a week to their poor families. Indeed, things were so bad that Groucho Marx joked that he knew things were bad when he saw the pigeons start to feed the people in Central Park. And even though you had a lot of people blaming the declining moral values, the majority of Americans actually clung to traditional family values. Church attendance went up. Divorces went down. Many of the young people put off getting married until later. Let's go to the next slide. The middle and working classes and hard times. Well, guys, the most common fear during this period was economic insecurity. How long was my job going to last? Some saw their businesses go bankrupt, like Harry S. Truman, who would later become a president. He saw his haberdashery or men's business go bankrupt, and they had to turn to new careers. You had people beginning companies out of their own homes, like beauty parlors, maybe kitchen bakeries, offer boarding. For example, one Milwaukee wife baked, and basically she sold her goods at 9 cents a loaf of bread, 25 cents for an apple cake. Through this, she was able to clear about $65 a month. A health inspector came by to close her down. She said, look, if you do that, I'm going to have to go on relief. In other words, the city's going to have to pay for me. And so pretty much the health inspector let her stay in business. Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. Kind of became a mantra. To save money, people sewed. Bake their own bread, canned. Basically, they'd take old flour bags or seed bags that were reused as cloth for clothing. Indeed, some of the flour companies knew what people were doing, so they would kind of put patterns on the insides of their bags and on their bags. So they'd show people, hey, look, if you make this into a dress, this is what it's going to look like. All right, we're going to the next one. Basically, people dined out less, went on less trips, began vegetable gardens, used local parks and libraries for entertainment. Yet, I love it, even though they're trying to cut costs, 65% of all families still spent 10 cents a week to go see a movie, at least once a week. They played board games, having fun, fantasizing about making and losing money in Monopoly, based on Atlantic City, New Jersey. About 1/6 of all families lost their homes and wound up doubling up or living with relatives, where you had two families in the same home. Ready to go to the next one? Many men felt shamed by their lack of finding employment. Some become hobos and found it was better to try a home and ask the woman of the house for a few sandwiches rather than search through the garbage. You had thousands fleeing rural areas, especially residents of Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. They were known as the Arkies, taking with them pretty much everything they had to get out to California. A trek that was brilliantly portrayed in John Steinbeck's book, The Grapes of Wrath. And on to the next slide. Discrimination and the Depression. Basically, the Depression forced many African Americans, more than 400,000, to leave the South to head for the urban centers of the North. In some places in the South, they earned 40 cents a day picking cotton. You had racial violence occurring when competition for jobs were present. But blacks who lived in the North found the same discrimination, with their unemployment being 20 to 50% higher. Ready to go to the next slide? Well, what about Latino Americans? Well, they faced discrimination. Indeed, they were fired to give jobs to whites in the Southwest. In Tucson, Arizona, Mexicans were accused of taking the bread out of our white children's mouths. In Orange County, California, though, they actually did. They were kind of very progressive. They did provide their Hispanic population with free transportation. Well, back to Mexico. It was given to more than 2,000 Mexican nationals to reduce the people that were on the relief. Ready to go to the next one? For Asian Americans, well, 1/6 of all Asian Americans were on relief, but they received 10 to 20% less relief than everybody else did. The reason why is because the relief agencies concluded that Asians could live on less food because they were smaller. And of course, it's come as a little surprise that in response to this, you have the Japanese American Citizens League formed to basically help fight and protect their rights. Right, getting ready to go to the next slide. Women in the Depression. Well, of course, women had jobs with lower salaries, but they were less likely to be laid off at labor positions. Indeed, professional positions like teachers, women's numbers actually declined from 14.2% of all teachers to only 12.3%. And most people, women included, believe that men should get the first pick at jobs. And many companies and local governments actually had a policy of not hiring married women, and 63% of places fired women once they did become married. By 1933, 145,000 women were homeless. And the sad thing is that rural women had even less opportunities and more challenges because the domestic service jobs of the cities, like being a maid or a washwoman, were not available to them. So who might save us? Alright, go to the next slide. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now this is a guy who was born into wealth and privilege. He had attended elite schools, including Harvard and Columbia Law School. Now he was Teddy Roosevelt's fifth cousin. He entered New York politics in 1910 and had won a seat in the New York legislature. He was tall, handsome, charming, glib, and would work with almost anyone, including Tammany Hall, to get things done. And he moved up the political ladder very quickly. Indeed, by 1920, James Cox made Roosevelt his running mate. And even though Cox was defeated, it got more people to know and love Roosevelt until something happened. Going to the next slide. In 1921, Roosevelt was suddenly struck with polio. Basically, it paralyzed him from the waist down. He was unwilling to surrender and become a forgotten man, so Roosevelt worked hard to overcome his handicap, slowly advancing until he was able to walk using heavy steel braces on his legs, as well as using crutches. His wife, Eleanor, worked tirelessly with him. Indeed, he got so good that he delivered the nominating speech for Al Smith in 1924, once again giving him national acclaim. Next slide. So we get to the 1932 election. Basically, Roosevelt was nominated over more experienced politicians like Al Smith and Texan Jack Garner. So, of course, Roosevelt, very smart, got Garner, Texan Jack Garner, to be his vice president. And Roosevelt broke with tradition and flew out to the convention in Chicago to accept the nomination, where he promised a new deal for the American people, which the press just loved, and they cut it down to the New Deal. And to unite his party, Roosevelt chose Garner as his running mate, like I told you, and he supported direct relief as well as a balanced budget. So this whole election kind of became a competition between two different philosophies of government. Roosevelt relied on his biggest assets, his energy and his contagious optimism. And the election was a huge success for the Democratic Party as they swept state and local offices, giving Roosevelt 57.4% of the 39.7 million votes cast, and Hoover cast only 8 states. Alright, hope you enjoyed this lecture. Once again, I'll let you know what's going to be on the online quiz for Thursday. I'll let you know that by Wednesday, or Tuesday actually. You can study for it, take the quiz on Thursday, And there we have it. All right. Hope you enjoyed it. Be on the lookout because I'm also going to be doing the next lecture. Thanks, because we're like 2 weeks behind.